The touch lasted barely 3 seconds. 3 seconds that turned the crowded lounge into a tomb, paralyzed the man Zariah was talking to, and transformed a desperate 6-month flight into a capture that couldn't be undone. Zariah Cole felt it in her marrow. The sudden drop in temperature, the way the air in the room thickened as if the walls themselves were closing in to witness her surrender. His lips hadn't even touched her skin. They had only brushed the pulse point on her neck before she tried to bolt. She was already moving, already reaching for the shadows of the exit to disappear once again. But the man didn't move, didn't reach, didn't even blink. He stood there like a mountain carved from obsidian, his massive frame swallowing the red neon glow of the bar. His shoulders were a broad horizon, his neck thick, his arms defined by ink that looked like armor beneath his skin. It was the kind of strength that didn't need to posturize. It was the kind that simply occupied space until there was nothing left for anyone else. Zariah's breath hitched. For a heartbeat, she wondered if the life she had tried to build was about to be leveled by a single word. "Tae-Jean," she whispered, her voice thinner than the glass she had just set down. His eyes finally drifted from the crowd to her face. Dark, intense, unreadable. They didn't soften at the sight of her. They locked onto her like a predator calculating the distance to its prey. "You ran," he said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. Zariah swallowed, suddenly aware of the heat radiating from his chest, inches from her own. She lifted her chin, her hand pressing instinctively against his t-shirt, feeling the granite-hard muscle beneath the cotton. "I had to," she replied, her fingers trembling against him. The bar around them remained a blurred mess of shocked faces and frozen drinks. A glass shattered somewhere in the distance, but the sound didn't penetrate the vacuum he had created. He placed one large hand on her chin, his thumb hooking under her jaw with a grip that was both a caress and a cage. He didn't need to use force. His presence alone trapped her. His other hand remained at his side, steady and relaxed. "You shouldn't have gone," he said calmly, his voice a low vibration that thrummed through her. "But I'm not letting you go twice." The memory of that morning in Seoul clawed its way to the surface, sharp and jagged, as Zariah stood frozen under Tae-Jean's heavy gaze. 6 months ago, the air hadn't smelled of expensive lounge tobacco and neon. It had smelled of rain and the sterile plastic of a pregnancy test. She had been sitting on the edge of her bathtub, staring at the 2 pink lines until they blurred into a single, terrifying neon sign. The father was a man she knew only as the ghost in a 3-piece suit, the CEO who had looked at her with a hunger that felt like a claim even then. She had expected a clean break, a one-night encounter to be filed away under reckless mistakes. But the plastic stick in her hand was a contract she never intended to sign. The panic had been a cold, rising tide. But the reality of who he was didn't truly hit her until she walked to the window of her small apartment to draw the curtains. The street below was usually a chaotic mess of delivery scooters and early morning commuters. That morning, it was unnaturally still. Parked directly across from her entrance were 3 identical black SUVs, their engines idling with a low, predatory hum. The tinted windows were impenetrable, but she didn't need to see inside to know who was behind them. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't a coincidence. It was the Kwan Syndicate's version of a greeting card. Tae-Jean hadn't even waited for her to tell him. He had already found out, and he was already surrounding her. She remembered the way her heart had hammered against her ribs, the same frantic rhythm it was beating now. She hadn't packed a suitcase. She had taken her passport, the stack of emergency cash she kept in a hollowed-out book, and the jacket she was wearing now. She had slipped out through the service exit of the neighboring building, climbing over rusted fences and disappearing into the labyrinth of the city's underground markets. She had spent 6 months becoming a ghost. She changed her hair, her name, and her life, moving from one cramped studio to another, always checking the rearview mirror for those obsidian-colored vehicles. She had convinced herself she was safe, that the vastness of the world was enough to swallow a woman who didn't want to be found. But standing here now, with Tae-Jean's thumb tracing the line of her jaw, Zariah realized the SUVs had never truly stopped idling. He hadn't lost the scent. He had simply been waiting for her to stop running so he could catch her in the light. The weight of his hand was a reminder that for a man like him, no was just a temporary delay, and gone was an impossibility. The 6 months of freedom she thought she had won were nothing more than a long leash, and tonight, Tae-Jin Kwon had finally decided to reel it in. The sanctuary of her anonymity was gone, shattered by the heat of his skin and the quiet, lethal certainty in his eyes. He knew about the child. He knew about the flight. And as his fingers tightened slightly on her chin, she knew the vanishing act was over. The transition from the neon-soaked lounge to the silence of the black sedan was seamless, a predatory glide through a city that seemed to pull over and hold its breath as Tae-Jin's motorcade passed. Zaraya sat in the back seat, the leather upholstery cool against her trembling legs, while the man who had reclaimed her sat, so close she could feel the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. He didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. The presence of the 3 black SUVs flanking them was a louder statement than any threat he could have whispered. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a police station or a warehouse, but at the private entrance of the Kwon Tower, a spire of glass and steel that pierced the clouds like a needle. The penthouse was a cathedral of marble and minimalism, perched so high that the bustling lights of Seoul below looked like nothing more than glowing embers in a dying fire. Tae-Jin led her inside, his hand finally dropping from her jaw, though the ghost of his touch lingered like a brand. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the horizon. "The guest suite is through those doors," he said, his voice dropping into that low, melodic friction that made her skin prickle. "Everything you require has already been placed there. Clothes in your size. The vitamins your doctor prescribed 2 weeks ago." Zaraya flinched. He hadn't just found her. He had been watching her living room, her trash, her medical records. "I want to go home, Tae-Jin." He turned, the dim light of the penthouse catching the sharp edge of his jaw and the intricate ink crawling up his neck. "You are home, Zaraya." She marched toward the heavy oak front doors, her fingers curling around the cold metal handle. She expected it to be locked, a physical manifestation of her captivity. She pulled. The door swung open with a smooth, effortless groan. Zaraya stepped into the hallway, but her feet stopped dead. 2 men in charcoal suits stood like stone gargoyles on either side of the frame. They didn't move to block her, they didn't reach for their holstered weapons, and they didn't even look at her. They simply stood there, their silence a chilling reminder that there was nowhere for her to run. Beyond them, the elevator required a biometric scan he hadn't given her. The fire stairs were monitored by cameras that never blinked. She stepped back into the penthouse, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt heavier than a deadbolt. "I don't lock doors, Zaraya," Tae-Jin murmured, moving closer until his massive frame blotted out the city lights. "I don't have to. You could walk out that door, take the stairs, and reach the street. But you wouldn't make it to the corner before my world swallowed you whole again." He wasn't using iron bars to keep her. He was using his shadow. The city she had hidden in for 6 months had been transformed in a single night from a sanctuary into a sprawling, multi-million-acre prison. Every CCTV camera was his eye. Every black car on the road was his hand. He had placed her at the highest point in the sky, just so she could see exactly how far his reach extended. She was free to move, free to breathe, and free to stay, because Tae-Jin Kwon had made sure that running was no longer an option. The sun rose over Seoul not as a herald of a new day, but as a spotlight on the polished glass of the Kwon Tower. Zaraya stood by the window of the penthouse, the silence of the marble floors feeling more oppressive than any prison cell. Tae-Jin had emerged from his room at dawn, already armored in a 3-piece navy suit that hid the tattoos and the violence of the night before. He looked like the dream of every financial magazine, a visionary, a titan, a man of absolute order. "Stay close today," he had commanded, not as a request, but as a condition of her breathing. By noon, she was seated in the shadows of his executive boardroom, a ghost in a leather jacket watching a masterclass in corporate warfare. Tae-Jin sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his voice calm and melodic as he dismantled a merger proposal. He spoke of logistics, profit margins, and market volatility with a clinical precision that made the room full of older, powerful men sweat. He was the perfect CEO, patient, articulate, and terrifyingly brilliant. Looking at him then, it was almost possible to forget the way his thumb had hooked under her jaw at the lounge, or the fact that he was the reason she had spent 6 months looking over her shoulder. But the mask didn't slip until the final signature was dried. When the room cleared, Tae-jin didn't return to his penthouse. He led her to a private elevator, one that required a distinct biometric key hidden behind a mahogany panel. They didn't go up, they went down, deep into the belly of the building where the air grew cold, and the hum of the HVAC system became a dull, mechanical roar. The basement was a labyrinth of concrete and steel, stripped of the penthouse's luxury. As the heavy doors slid open, the corporate titan vanished. Tae-jin shed his suit jacket, tossing it to a waiting guard, and rolled up his sleeves to reveal the ink crawling down his forearms like a warning. In the center of the room, a man was strapped to a chair, his face a map of terror. He was one of the executives from the meeting above, a man who, moments ago, had been laughing at Tae-jin's jokes. Now he was sobbing. "You leaked the shipment coordinates to the O'Shea family," Tae-jin said. His voice hadn't changed. It was still that low, friction-filled vibration, but the context had turned it into a death knell. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't even raise his hand. He simply leaned in, invading the man's space with the same overwhelming presence he had used on Zariah the night before. Zariah watched, her hand pressing against the slight swell of her stomach, as the CEO methodically broke the man's spirit. It wasn't a tantrum. It was an interrogation conducted with the same efficiency as the board meeting. Tae-jin spoke of loyalty and consequences as if they were line items on a balance sheet, his obsidian eyes devoid of empathy. The duality was staggering. The man who dictated market trends was the same man who dictated who lived to see the morning. As the executive finally shrieked a confession, Tae-jin straightened his tie and looked at Zariah. There was no apology in his gaze, only a cold, hard truth. The billionaire was just a front for the boss, and the father of her child was a monster who owned the light and the dark in equal measure. The chill of the basement lingered in Zariah's bones long after they returned to the silent luxury of the penthouse. The transition back to opulence felt like a fever dream. The man who had just dismantled a trader's life was now pouring a glass of mineral water with steady, manicured hands. He had put his jacket back on, the navy wool once again concealing the ink and the brutality, but the air around him remained charged with the aftershocks of the interrogation. Tae-jin didn't sit. He walked toward her, pulling a small, velvet-lined box from his pocket. He set it on the marble counter between them, the click of the latch echoing in the cavernous room. Inside lay a necklace, a delicate, teardrop-shaped emerald suspended by a chain of white gold so fine it looked like woven moonlight. It was beautiful, a masterpiece of billionaire excess that seemed at odds with the concrete walls they had just left. "You left with nothing," Tae-jin said, his voice dropping into that low, melodic friction. "A Quan woman does not wear a leather jacket and fear. She wears this." Zariah looked at the gem, its green depths swirling like a stormy sea. "I don't want your jewelry, Tae-jin. I want the 6 months I had before you stepped back into my life." He ignored her protest, stepping into her space until the scent of his woodsy cologne and the heat of his massive frame overwhelmed her. He took the necklace out, his tattooed fingers moving with agonizing slowness as he draped the cold metal around her neck. Zariah shivered as his knuckles brushed her skin, the contrast between his lethal strength and the delicate jewelry making her breath hitch. As he fastened the clasp, he leaned down, his lips ghosting over the pulse point on her neck, the same spot he had claimed at the lounge. "It suits you," he murmured against her skin. "Keep it on. Always." It wasn't until he stepped back, a flicker of dark satisfaction in his obsidian eyes, that Zariah felt the weight of the pendant. It was heavier than it looked. She raised a hand to the emerald, her thumb tracing the smooth underside of the setting. There, hidden beneath the gold, was a small, microscopic indentation, a sensor that hummed with a vibration so faint it was almost a heartbeat. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a gift of affection or an apology for the basement. It was a tether. "Is this so I don't get lost again?" she asked, her voice laced with a bitter edge. Tae-jin picked up his glass, his expression shifting back to that emotionally unreadable CEO mask. "I spent a fortune and half a year scouring the globe for a ghost, Soraya. I do not intend to repeat the experience." He didn't have to explain the technology. She knew that as long as that emerald rested against her chest, he would know her coordinates to the inch. He would know if her heart rate spiked, if she stepped outside the perimeter of his influence, or if she tried to find a service exit in another city. The golden handcuffs had finally been locked. He hadn't just given her his name or his protection. He had branded her with a high-tech mark of ownership. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The emerald glowed with a malevolent green light, a beautiful, sparkling reminder that the vanishing act was truly over. She was no longer a woman in hiding. She was a marked asset of the Quan Syndicate, and Tae-jin was making sure that even if she ran, she would always be running toward him. The emerald on Zoraya's neck felt like a cold stone that never got warm. Every time she looked in the mirror, it reminded her that Tae-jin was always watching. He was busy with his big meetings, so he let her walk in the private garden on the roof. It was the only place where the air felt real, even if the glass walls still made it a cage. A woman was there, trimming the roses. When she turned around, Zoraya's heart jumped. It was Elena. Back in the months when Zoraya was hiding, Elena had been her only friend. They had shared cheap coffee and talked about a future where they were free. "Zoraya?" Elena whispered, her eyes wide. "I couldn't believe it when I heard you were here. I got a job with the cleaning staff just to find you." Zoraya felt a rush of hope. For a second, she wasn't a prisoner of the Quan Syndicate. She was just a girl talking to a friend. She reached out to touch Elena's arm, but then she saw it. Elena wasn't looking at her face. She was staring at the emerald necklace with a look that wasn't about friendship. It was a look of greed. "He's a monster, Zoraya," Elena said, her voice getting fast and low. "Everyone knows what he does in the dark. You don't belong here. You don't have to be his puppet." Zoraya looked away, thinking of the man in the basement. "He is dangerous, Elena. You shouldn't be here." "I can help you," Elena said, stepping closer. She leaned in, her voice a sharp hiss. "There are people who want to take him down. Powerful people. If you give me the codes to his private elevator, or tell us where he goes at night, they will get you out. You and the baby can be free forever." Zoraya froze. The air in the garden suddenly felt as thin as the air in the basement. She looked at Elena and realized the truth. Elena hadn't found her by luck. She had been sent. She was a spy for the O'Shea family, the rivals Tae-jin had mentioned. They didn't want to save her. They wanted to use her to kill the father of her child. It was a test. Zoraya hated Tae-jin. She hated the way he tracked her and the way he forced her into his world. But as she looked at Elena, she realized that Tae-jin's cruelty was a shield. If she betrayed him, she wasn't choosing freedom. She was choosing a different kind of monster. "I don't know any codes," Zoraya said, her voice turning as cold and hard as the emerald. Elena's face changed. The kindness vanished, replaced by something jagged and mean. "Don't be a fool. You think he loves you? You're just a box for his heir. Once that baby is born, you're nothing." Zoraya stood up straight, her petite frame feeling stronger than it ever had. She realized then that she was trapped between two fires. She wasn't ready to love Tae-jin, but she wasn't going to let his enemies touch her. "Get out," Zoraya commanded. As Elena disappeared into the shadows of the building, Zoraya touched the necklace. It was a tracker, yes, but it was also a warning. She was in the middle of a war, and for the first time, she understood that the man she was trying to hate was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. The night of the gala was not about fun. It was about power. Zoraya stood in front of a mirror while 3 women fixed her hair and makeup. They dressed her in a gown of dark silk that felt like water. Around her neck, the emerald glowed like a green eye. Tae-jin entered the room, looking sharp in a black tuxedo. He didn't say she looked pretty. He just looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and nodded. He took her hand, and his grip was as firm as a lock. The ballroom was filled with gold lights and the smell of expensive flowers. Important people in suits and sparkling dresses turned to look as they walked in. Taejin didn't hide her in a corner. He led her right to the middle of the room. He introduced her as his partner, his voice low and steady. Every time he spoke her name, the people around them looked shocked. They knew who he was, and now they knew who she was. She wasn't just a secret anymore. She was a target. "Stay close to me," Taejin whispered. His hand stayed on the small of her back. She could feel the heat of him through her dress. For a moment, she felt like a queen. But then, the air changed. A loud crash echoed from the front doors. Men in masks rushed in, and the music stopped. Screams filled the air. The lights flickered and went out, leaving only the red emergency glow. Zaraya felt Taejin pull her behind a marble pillar. His movements were fast and smooth. He didn't look scared. He looked ready. He shed his tuxedo jacket in one quick motion. Under the red light, his black t-shirt showed the massive muscles of his arms. The tattoos on his skin looked like moving shadows. Zaraya watched, her breath catching, as the CEO vanished completely. One of the masked men ran toward them, raising a weapon. Taejin didn't flinch. He stepped forward and met the man with a force that sounded like a car crash. It was brutal. Taejin didn't fight like a person in a movie. He fought like a machine. He used his hands and feet to disable the attackers with cold, hard strikes. He didn't show any mercy. When one man tried to grab Zaraya, Taejin's face turned into something terrifying. He caught the man's arm and twisted it until the bone snapped. His eyes were focused and icy, showing the boss who ruled the city's dark streets. Zaraya pressed her back against the cold marble, her hands over her stomach. She saw the blood on his knuckles and the way his tattoos seemed to glow in the red light. He was a monster, but in this moment, he was her monster. He stood between her and the gunman, a wall of muscle and ink that nothing could break. When the room finally went quiet, Taejin stood over the fallen men. He wasn't breathing hard. He wiped a drop of blood from his cheek and turned to her. The ruthlessness was still in his eyes, but it softened just a tiny bit when he saw she was safe. He reached out and touched the emerald on her neck to make sure it was still there. She realized then that the gala wasn't a party. It was a trap, and Taejin had just shown the world what happened to anyone who tried to touch what belonged to him. The ride back to the penthouse was filled with a heavy silence. The smell of smoke and gunpowder still clung to Taejin's skin. When the elevator doors finally opened, Zaraya didn't wait for him to give a command. She went straight to the kitchen and grabbed a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. Taejin sat on the edge of the large leather sofa, his head resting in his hands. He had pulled his shirt off, and the red light from the city outside hit the scars and tattoos on his back. Zaraya knelt beside him. Her hands shook a little at first, but she forced herself to be steady. She dipped the cloth into the water and began to wipe the blood from his knuckles. He winced when the water touched a deep cut, but he didn't move away. Up close, he didn't look like the scary boss from the ballroom. He looked tired. He looked like a man who carried the weight of the whole city on his broad shoulders. "You should have stayed in the car," he murmured. His voice was a low growl, but it didn't have its usual bite. "I'm not a child, Taejin," Zaraya replied softly. She moved the cloth to a bruise on his shoulder. "And I'm not just a box for your air. You can't keep me behind glass forever." Taejin finally looked at her. His obsidian eyes were not cold anymore. They were filled with a strange kind of pain. He reached out and caught her wrist, stopping her hand. For a long second, he just stared at her. The silence in the room felt like it was pressing against them. "I didn't just look for you because of the baby," he admitted. The words seemed to cost him a lot to say. He looked away, back toward the window. "I have plenty of people who bow to me. I have men who would die for me because they are afraid. But you were the only person who looked at my world and chose to walk away." Zaraya froze. She thought about the morning she saw the black cars and ran into the ring. She thought she was just a fugitive. She never realized that her escape had actually earned his respect. "I wanted the woman who had the courage to leave me," he whispered. He pulled her hand toward his chest, letting her feel the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. Everyone else wants something from me. You just wanted your freedom. It made me realize that you were the only real thing in my life." Zariah felt a lump in her throat. She had spent months trying to hate him, trying to see him only as a monster. But as she looked at the wounds he had taken to keep her safe, the walls around her own heart began to crack. He was still a dangerous man, and his world was still a cage. But for the first time, she saw the person behind the ink. He wasn't just reclaiming a piece of property. He was trying to hold on to the only person who had ever been brave enough to tell him no. The morning air felt cold, even inside the fancy penthouse. 3 old men sat in the living room. They were the elders of the syndicate, the ones who had helped Tae-Jin's father build his empire. They wore expensive suits and looked at Zariah like she was a bug on a windshield. Tae-Jin stood in front of them, his arms crossed and his face like a wall of stone. "The gala was a mess, Tae-Jin," the oldest man said. His voice sounded like dry paper. "You put yourself in danger for a woman. A distraction. The O'Shea family saw you bleed because of her. This cannot happen again." Zariah stood in the hallway, hiding behind the corner. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She could hear the mean tone in their voices. They didn't care about her or the baby. To them, she was just a mistake that made their boss look weak. "The girl must go," another elder added. "Send her away. We will take the child when it is born, but she is a risk we cannot afford. Choose the business, Tae-Jin. Choose the Quan name." The room went silent. Zariah held her breath, waiting for Tae-Jin to speak. For a second, she was afraid. She remembered the cold man in the basement and the way he looked at the traitor. Would he give her up to keep his crown? Tae-Jin took a slow step forward. When he spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous growl. "You think I built this empire just to let you tell me who I can keep? You think my name is more important than my own blood? It is the way of the family," the elder snapped. "Then the family is dead," Tae-Jin said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gold coin, the symbol of his high rank in the syndicate. He threw it onto the marble table. It made a sharp, ringing sound that felt like a bell. "I am the Quan name. If you want a boss who chooses money over his heart, go find one. But if you touch her, or if you even look at her again, I will burn everything we built to the ground." The elders gasped. They looked at the gold coin as if it were on fire. By throwing it away, Tae-Jin was breaking the bridge between him and the old ways. He was giving up their support to keep Zariah safe. He was turning his back on the only world he had ever known. "You are making a mistake," the old man hissed as they stood up to leave. "You will be alone." "I am never alone," Tae-Jin replied. When the heavy doors finally closed behind the elders, Zariah stepped out from the shadows. Tae-Jin turned to her. He looked older, tired, but his eyes were steady. He had just given up his throne for her. He had burned his bridge to the past so they could have a future. Zariah walked over and took his hand, the one with the bruised knuckles. For the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like she was part of a team. Tae-Jin pulled her close, and as he rested his chin on her head, she knew the war was far from over, but he had already decided which side he was on. The sun rose over a different kind of Quan Tower. The glass didn't look like a needle anymore. It looked like a shield. Zariah stood in the middle of the CEO's office, the same room where she had once felt like a ghost. Today, she wasn't wearing a leather jacket. She wore a sharp, cream-colored suit that matched the bright morning light. Behind her, the city of Seoul stretched out, but it didn't look like a prison. It looked like a job. Tae-Jin stood by the window, but he wasn't looking at the streets. He was looking at her. He had traded his navy suits for simple black shirts that covered his tattoos, but everyone in the building knew who he was. They just didn't fear his knuckles anymore. They feared his silence. He had kept his promise. He had burned down the old, violent ways of the syndicate. Now, he was the shadow that stood behind the throne, while Zariah sat upon it. "The board is waiting," Tae-Jin murmured. His voice was still that low, friction-filled vibration, but it sounded proud. "They are ready to sign the final papers to make the company fully legal. No more blood money. No more hidden shipments." Zariah picked up a heavy fountain pen. She felt the weight of the emerald necklace against her skin. It was still a tracker, and it was still a mark of the Quan name, but it had changed meaning. It was no longer a chain. It was a badge of the new empire they had built together. She was the face of the company, the brilliant mind that turned the darkness into light. She was the one who ensured that their daughter, who was growing stronger every day inside her, would never have to know the sound of a gun or the smell of a basement interrogation. "You're sure about this?" Zoraya asked, looking at the man who had once been her captor. "Giving up the power of the boss." Taejin walked over and placed his hand over hers on the desk. His grip was still firm, still a lock, but it was gentle. "I found a different kind of power, Zoraya. I have the only thing I ever really wanted. I have the woman who was brave enough to change me." Zoraya smiled and signed her name in bold, clear letters. With that single stroke of a pen, the Quan Syndicate officially died, and the Quan Corporation was born. The transition was complete. Taejin took her hand and led her toward the boardroom. As they walked through the halls, the employees bowed, but not out of terror. They bowed because they respected the new queen. The war was over. The vanishing act was a distant memory. Zoraya looked at Taejin and saw the man he had become, a protector who stayed in the shadows so she could shine in the sun. They had turned a reckless knight into a legacy. As the doors to the boardroom opened, Zoraya stepped in first, her head held high, ready to lead their new empire into a future that was bright, clean, and finally, truly free.